Okay, welcome everybody to the final session of this conference on COVID-19, borders, and the law. This panel will be focusing on the impact of COVID-19 on migrants and refugees, and looking in particular at the situation in three different regions: the Mediterranean, South America, and Southeast Asia. And we're very lucky to have with us three leading experts on the topic. And what I plan to do is, rather than introduce all of them in one go, I'll briefly introduce each of the speakers before their presentations. And each speaker will have 15 minutes, and then that should leave us plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end. And for members of the audience and also the panelists, please do feel free to type any questions or comments in the chat box as we go along. And then after the third presentation, I'll try to collate these and ask the speakers to respond. So to begin, our first presenter is Sofia Galani, and Professor Galani is an assistant professor at the Panteion University of Athens, and previously she was at the University of Bristol. Her research interests lie in maritime security, the law of the sea, and human rights and terrorism. And she'll speak with us today on migration in the Mediterranean at the time of the pandemic. Professor Galani?
Well, good evening to those of you who are in Hong Kong, and hello to everyone else who are in different time zones. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this very kind invitation and thank them for the effort to pull this event together, although I understand that most of us are not able to be in Hong Kong. I have been asked to talk about migration in the Mediterranean Sea during the pandemic. So what I will try to do in the next 15 minutes or so is to give you a better idea of how the situation affected migrants and refugees trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea during the pandemic. And more importantly, the impact that port closures had on those people. And after discussing these issues, I will try to focus more on the legal issues arising from this situation. And more specifically, I will try to answer the question of whether states had the right to close their borders and more specifically their ports. And then whether this decision was compatible with other obligations that they have under international law to protect migrants and refugees at sea. So as you all know, the Mediterranean Sea has been very busy with migrants and refugees trying to cross it and reach Europe over the last years. And there are three routes. The busiest route is the Western Mediterranean route that connects Morocco to Spain, the Central Mediterranean route that connects Libya to Italy, and the Eastern Mediterranean route that connects Turkey to Greece. What is interesting is that during the first wave of the pandemic in Europe, the migration crossings from West and Central Africa nearly halved. And we also saw a significant reduction in crossings from Turkey to Greece during that time. At the same time, the NGO vessels suspended their operations. But this only lasted for the very first wave. The peak of the pandemic in Europe, which was in 2020. But since then, it looks like it has been business as usual. And there, of course, there is a significant number of people trying to cross the Mediterranean Sea as they used to do before. So what we saw is that, as we all know, in response to the pandemic, a lot of states closed their borders. So the UN reported at the beginning of the pandemic that about 167 states closed their borders, and 57 countries closed their borders, making no exceptions to asylum seekers. So the situation became even more difficult and even more dangerous for them, especially for those who were trying to cross borders by using boats. Border closures, of course, included port closures because states decided to also close their sea borders. And this meant, we saw that especially in the Mediterranean Sea, that migrants and refugees would be rescued by NGO vessels, but then these vessels would not be allowed to go ashore because states were saying, especially Malta, Italy, Greece, and Spain, that we have our border closed for public health reasons, so we're not allowing anyone to disembark. When they started relaxing the rules and they started allowing disembarkation, what we also saw in the Mediterranean Sea is that states, especially Malta, started using boats as quarantine places. So they would allow the NGO vessels to go to their ports, but they would not allow the migrants and refugees that had been rescued to disembark on land. They would transfer them immediately to vessels that were being used as quarantine places. Now, there are two problems here. The first one is that these vessels were not designed to accommodate all of these people. And we saw very poor conditions where people were cramped without proper hygiene standards. And there were a lot of problems with them being there. And the other issue that we saw is that although this was supposed to be a quarantine period and it was supposed to last for 14 days, there were many cases in which this period was extended. So they essentially used the quarantine as an excuse to detain migrants for long period of times. The other tactic that we saw a lot in the Mediterranean Sea were pushbacks. Pushbacks were used as a precautionary measure, both on land and at sea. Greece, for example, which closed their borders quite early on and took very strict measures to contain the spread of the virus, used pushbacks a lot in the Aegean Sea. And the justification was that this is necessary in order to protect the public health of the Greek population. Now, one of the first questions that arises here is, do states have the right to close their ports? Were they allowed to close their ports as part of the border restrictions measures that they enacted in response to COVID-19? The answer is yes, and we know that from customary law, and we know that from the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea as well. So, for example, in the Nicaragua case, the court said that ports are within the internal waters of states, and the internal waters are subject to the sovereignty of the coastal state. And the same is mentioned in the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. At the same time, Article 25 of UNCLOS also confirms that a coastal state has the right to regulate access to the port, so they might attach special requirements for a vessel to enter the ports, or again, they might deny entry to a port, including for public health reasons. Now, the other question that arises, of course, is, okay, they have the right to close the ports, but what about the other duties that they have under international law? And we know that states have duties to rescue migrants and refugees at sea, both under the international law of the sea and international human rights law. So, for example, according to the international law of the sea and UNCLOS, Article 98 states very clearly that states have a duty to render assistance to persons in distress. Now, one issue that we have here, and it's a general problem that we experience with seaborne migration, is that it is not clear what a distress phase is. And this, of course, was abused by states even more during the pandemic. So the Search and Rescue Convention says that the distress phase is a situation when a person faces an imminent danger and requires immediate assistance. But states in the Mediterranean, European states especially, have interpreted this very narrowly. And what they say is that if migrants and refugees have been rescued by an NGO vessel, they no longer face an immediate danger and they no longer require immediate assistance. So if they've been rescued by NGO vessels, we have nothing else to do. And this is what led what I explained earlier, situations in which NGO vessels would rescue migrants and refugees, but then coastal states would refuse to accept them, citing as a reason the fact that their borders were closed because of the pandemic, and saying that they are not in distress anymore, so we have nothing to do with them. The other problem, again, that is a very common challenge when we deal with migration at sea, is what we mean by a place of safety. We know that rescued persons must be taken to a place of safety. This is what the Search and Rescue Convention says. But this is not defined in the convention, and this has prompted an intense debate between states. The International Maritime Organization has tried to define what a place of safety is in guidelines that it issued in 2004, but these guidelines, of course, are non-binding. And the IMO has said that the place of safety is a place where the survivor's safety of life is no longer threatened and where their basic human needs, such as food, shelter, and medical needs, can be met. Again, during the pandemic, this was something that states, again, they said that if migrants and refugees are rescued by commercial vessels, by NGO vessels, they are in a place of safety because they face no risk, they're given food, they're given water, so we're not opening our borders for them. And again, this created very difficult situations, especially during the pandemic, because some of those people that had been rescued had already been affected by COVID before leaving Africa or Turkey, and they required medical assistance. And coastal states would refuse to give them this assistance. And at the same time, for the NGO vessels, it was extremely difficult to keep the hygiene standards and make sure that the others will not be affected on board. So it was very difficult for their medical needs to be met. And again, states would say that our ports are closed, there's nothing we can do. But of course, this would raise many issues under international human rights law as well. And by now, there have been a number of cases in which courts and human rights bodies have confirmed that states exercise jurisdiction for the purposes of human rights at sea, and in different contexts. So the Human Rights Committee, for example, in a decision that was issued last year in a complaint brought by migrants against Italy, the committee said that Italy had failed to protect the right to life because it failed to respond properly to a distress call, and because it failed to ask one of its warships that was near the shipwreck site to go there and provide assistance to those in need. So what we see here is that there is an obligation under the law of the sea, there is an obligation under human rights law for states to provide assistance to people in distress. And of course, COVID was not, despite the exceptional circumstances that it created, it did not give states the right to derogate from these obligations. There are a number of cases pending before the European Court of Human Rights that relate to pushback operations. And it will be interesting to see what the court will say, because as I said, there have been a lot of pushback operations during the pandemic. If the court follows the same line of reasoning, we are pretty sure that, again, more violations of the right to life will be found by the court. And of course, we have the issue of prohibition and prevention of torture, cruel and inhumane treatment and punishment. And we know there have been cases, the JHA against Spain, for example, a complaint decided by the United Nations Committee Against Torture, where it was said that Spain was responsible for migrants that had been intercepted and detained on board a vessel. There, the migrants complained that the conditions of detention were very poor, that they were cramped, that they did not have enough food, they did not have access to outdoor space, and the committee there said that this is against the Convention on the Prevention of Torture. And again, we've seen similar situations, and it's what I described earlier. For example, the boats that Malta used for quarantine. And again, there we had issues, and there have been clear violations of the right of these people to be free from torture and ill treatment. Another issue, a final issue before I conclude, because I wouldn't like to go over my time, has to do with flag state jurisdiction. Again, we know both under the law of the sea, Article 19 of the United Nations Convention, and human rights law, that flag states exercise jurisdiction on board the vessels that fly their flags. And this means that flag states have a duty to enforce human rights on board their vessels. But this has been problematic during the pandemic in the Mediterranean Sea because the coastal states have used that as an excuse to shift the burden and the responsibility from them to the NGO vessels. So there have been instances in which NGO vessels rescued people. The conditions were very bad on board the vessel. And the coastal states would say it's not a responsibility, it's the flag states. And you probably know that the NGO vessels that operate in the Mediterranean Sea are flagged to Norway, to Germany, but not to Italy or Spain or Malta or Greece. But of course, this is legally correct. I mean, strictly speaking, the NGO vessels as flag states, and the flag states were responsible for the conditions on board the vessel. But obviously, it is a requirement that they transfer these people ashore in order for the rights of these people to be effectively protected. So again, this is something that, legally speaking, they were right in what they were saying. But I mean, again, we saw how they abused that in order for them to say, we have our borders closed, it's not our responsibility. So just to conclude very briefly, I mean, what we know, it's now well established, it is clear that states have obligations to protect migrants and refugees at sea. And we know that under the law of the sea, human rights law, and of course there are other conventions such as the Refugee Convention that is also relevant and applicable. These obligations should not change during the pandemic. As I said earlier, the exceptional circumstances should not mean that states suddenly have the right to derogate from the protection of these rights. But what we saw is that the pandemic was used as another excuse for states in the Mediterranean Sea, European states, to exploit these for border security purposes. They adopted even harsher responses to migration, and they used the COVID-19 pandemic as another excuse to keep those people out of the countries. And of course, this might have been an issue to other places around the world. Of course, the Mediterranean is not where the only place where migration takes place. But this became more evident and more problematic in the Mediterranean Sea because there are very high flows of migration. And because we know that the European states have taken some very heavy-handed responses to migrants and refugees trying to reach the European states. Thank you very much. I will stop here and will be happy to answer any questions later on.
Thank you very much, Sofia, for that excellent overview of the situation in the Mediterranean. I mean, it affects a large number of people. And before the pandemic, many of the problems that you discussed actually were already evident, as you noted, but now the pandemic is being used as an excuse in order to, and this seems to be a theme that we've been seeing in a lot of the presentations during the conference about how the pandemic has been used in a way to reinforce policies that actually were implemented in order to increase border controls before the pandemic began in the first place. Okay, so our next speaker is Professor Sriprapha Petcharamesree, and she's the director of the International PhD Program in Human Rights and Peace Studies at the Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies at Mahibol University in Thailand. She's also served as the Thai representative on the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, and her research focuses on human rights, ASEAN studies, Southeast Asian studies, migration, including statelessness and citizenship, business and human rights, and international relations. Professor Petcharamesree.
Thank you, Kelley. I noticed that you pronounced my name and my family name perfectly.
I did.
Unbelievable. You did, yeah.
I'm shocked.
Good evening and good morning, wherever you are. I would like to start by thanking the organizers for having me on this panel. My talk is actually based on a paper entitled Citizenship, Exclusive State and Transboundary Pandemic, a paper that I wrote last year when different waves of COVID-19 intensified in South Asia and restrictions were strengthened in most, if not all, countries in the region. I am sorry that for not having any slide to show. I'm glad that Sofia didn't have one. my my approach that the approach that I apply would be more socio-political than legal. Sorry for that, but I'll be trying to touch upon some laws as well. Um, just want to start by with the premise by looking at the borders, the concept of borders. Borders define, as we all know, geographical boundaries of political entities or legal jurisdictions, something that Sofia mentioned before. And a nation state defines its geographical limits by territory and its demographic limits by nationality. According to Coleman and Harding, a national of a given state is considered to be member of that particular political community. So those who are not nationals are aliens or foreigners who are not usually entitled to the same membership goods, and in many cases do not enjoy the same treatment. Here, we see division between nationals and non-nationals is oftentimes so clear that it creates the sense of us and them, and perpetuates the sense of an exclusive state through the borders of which no one can pass without control and restrictions. And that's what Sofia has actually mentioned in her presentation earlier. We all know, though, and this is from political point of view, that political or economic borders are arbitrary and imperfect. Unfortunately, the political authorities of modern state system use borders both conceptually and in practice to regulate memberships in terms of national citizenship, in spite of the fact that the boundaries of political community are not only no longer adequate, but also are being challenged by the global economy, communication technologies, and internationalization, transnationalization of networks, cultures, etc. The current COVID-19 pandemic presents a very clear testament to the borderless world, where the virus infects people indiscriminately beyond the confines of the borders. So this coronavirus has brought up issues of paradox of an exclusive state based on citizenship. It becomes even more evident when certain categories of people, migrants in this case, are excluded from assistance scheme provided by national governments. This resonates what Benedict Anderson wrote in his book, Imagined Communities, that nation state is an imagined political community. It is imagined as both inherently limited and sovereign. Because of this imagination, that the nation state is inherently exclusive. So with that kind of premise, this presentation deals with the issues of borders, as I already mentioned, exclusive state and the rise of migrants in the context of transboundary COVID-19 pandemic, using Southeast Asia as the case study. This presentation, I'll be providing brief overview of COVID-19 situation in the region very briefly and the effects on migrants. After that, I will examine responses by different states to see how some measures disproportionately affect migrants and how migrants are excluded from the benefits of such measures. I'll go further to analyze the paradox of the exclusive state and how, in turn, the exclusive state also suffers due to the self-constructed borders. It is not, easy to get an accurate statistics about how many migrants affected or infected by COVID-19 in each country. What is clear, though, is the fact that some countries, including Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, rely on migrant workers for their economy, while Malaysia and Thailand also host a number of refugees and asylum seekers. out of around 5.6 million inhabitants, Singapore had around 4.5 million foreign workers in 2020, 1 million of whom held the so-called low-skilled jobs, those who live in dorms and typically packed into rooms with 10 or more residents, making social distancing impossible. So their cramped, unhygienic living quarters have proved to be a hotbeds for virus clusters. Dorms, outbreaks accounted for 93% of Singapore's total cases in 2020. Like Singapore, Malaysia and Thailand also rely on migrant workers. More than 2 million live and work in Malaysia. This number exclude undocumented workers as well as stateless persons in the country. Malaysia grappled with a crisis similar to Singapore's dorm problem. A cluster of corona virus infections is overcrowded detention centers for migrants without papers. Similarly, Thailand hosts more than 3 million migrants from neighboring countries. Thousands lost their jobs due to the shutdowns of business, and those who remain in the country find it difficult to meet their basic daily needs. Although when compared with Singapore or even Malaysia, the number of migrants who have contracted COVID-19 is lower, but Thailand saw different waves of COVID-19 infections among migrant communities, markets in particular. In addition to cases of migrant infected in the capital and nearby provinces, where migrants are concentrating, a number of refugee asylum seekers, tested positive in the provinces as well. How different countries, at least these 3 countries, responded and how they treat the migrants. The coronavirus has put countries around the world, including Southeast Asian states, to an unprecedented test. I guess we all agree with that. Most countries have applied severe measures, as we heard from Sofia, including imposition of emergency law. Actually, Thailand still apply emergency law until now, after about 3 years or so. Similar measures have been applied in our association, aiming to contain the COVID-19 pandemic. As we know, closing borders, travel restrictions, social distancing, testing, closure of economic and social activities, to name just some. What we actually see is, for example, in Malaysia, the Malaysian government imposed the measures obliging migrants to test, the pandemic, of course, at their cost. This is some of the things that happened, and of course, many of them have been detained. In any new waves of outbreaks, and as I said, Malaysian authorities round up undocumented migrants, including children and refugees, in effort to stem the spread of the coronavirus. The outbreak of the virus also trigger episodes of xenophobia toward migrants. Migrants, as foreigners, has been accused of spreading disease, burdening the state, and taking jobs as the economy, plummeted. Migrants and refugees are also targeted and stigmatized. In these countries, and I just talked about 3 countries, the outbreak of COVID-19 among migrants is nothing but, for many of us, it is just a reflection of the lives of invisible and marginalized communities of workers who live in the fringe of the society. Even though Singapore and Thailand took more positive actions toward migrants later. But the situation of migrants amidst pandemic reflect the disparities of treatment between citizens and non-citizens. Most of the countries in the region, including Malaysia, Singapore, and Thailand, start relaxing strict measures in 2020, late 2020, and then 2021, and introduce different packages and series of economic stimulus to counter the serious negative impacts on their national economies. However, it's very unfortunate that non-citizens do not benefit from any of these assistance packages provided by their respective governments. So what's the paradox of exclusive states amidst the borderless pandemic? Although different treatment between nationals and non-nationals has been always apparent, the practice of excluding non-nationals from essential health services, humanitarian assistance, and economic stimulus scheme amid the global pandemic presents a paradox. The paradox of controlling them in a confined spaces while advising population to respect social distancing, the paradox of caring for citizens while limiting the resources to care for non-citizens who contribute as much as citizens to the economy of the country. The citizen and non-citizen divided, shaped by the concept of nation state and deployed to secure the dominance of citizens in inevitably marginalized particular groups considered different. And this practice of differencing is reflected in the allocation of resources to citizens who are members of a particular political community. Non-citizens are not usually entitled to the same membership goods, such as employment, emergency services, economic resources, political participation, or immunity from expulsion. And I guess that what Sofia was actually sharing with us earlier. In the context of COVID-19, this refers to health services, access to proper information, right to freedom of movement and expression, the right to adequate housing, and so on. From a human rights perspective, everyone has rights. However, despite favorable national legislation in some countries, for example, Thailand, the access to membership goods that I just put there seem to be exclusive, since in many cases, only citizens can enjoy this support. So this arbitrary differentiation between citizen and non-citizen during the pandemic caused migrants to suffer the worst of its effects. Such differentiation during the global health crisis, which does not spare any person, reflects a value-based exclusion, which serve to hide a much deeper form of injustice and inequality within the society. And in doing so, a state will equally suffer the worst health scenario, as is already seen in some countries such as Singapore. I'm quoting Camille Bismontet here, and she said, "It is in every ASEAN country's interest, both as a host and as a home nation for migrant workers, to see that such population have adequate support, both financially and medically, to help slow the spread of coronavirus cases in the region." So the practice of differentiation of population within the same borders only hurts the region, and it perpetuates conditions that cause everyone, citizen and non-citizen alike, to suffer. I just want to conclude by saying, by reminding the governments, and I'm quoting one medical doctor, but I call him medical and social. He is a Thai, but working at Yale University. He warned, and I quote, that COVID-19 does not distinguish between Thais and non-Thais. He he specifically talk about Thailand, saying that COVID-19 does not distinguish between Thais and non-Thais. An outbreak in any of these crowded migrant settlements affects all of us. There is no such a thing as us or them. From a COVID-19 standpoint, they are the proverbial ticking time bombs. A us Thai citizen versus them mentality just confirm exclusive state and works against inclusive citizenship. Thank you very much, Kelley.
Thank you very much, Sriprapha. Thank you for reminding us that how much COVID has actually, in many ways, starkly revealed just how arbitrary borders are. But then at the same time, COVID has also provided an opportunity for states to reinforce the exclusionary state and to reinforce these differences and disparities between citizens and non-citizens, which are also in themselves arbitrary. But then COVID has no borders, as you point out, and it affects everybody, but in unequal ways. Okay, so the next speaker, third speaker, is Professor Liliana Jubilut, who is based at the, and I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, the Universidade Católica de Santos in Brazil. She's been a visiting scholar at Columbia Law School and a visiting fellow at the Refugee Law Initiative at the University of London. And she's also worked as a refugee lawyer and protection officer and consultant for the UNHCR in Brazil. And she'll be speaking with us about migrants' examples from South America. Professor Jubilut.
Thank you very much, Kelley. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on in which part of the world you are on. I'd like to start by thanking the Center for Comparative and Public Law for the invitation, as well as the organizers for all the hard work in putting together this conference, and by adding a section on the impacts of COVID-19 and borders for migrants and refugees. As Kelley mentioned, I'm going to be addressing how COVID-19 has reinforced challenges for the protection of forced migrants, with examples from South America. So I will start by recapturing or recalling which are these migration challenges that we are facing before the pandemic, and then highlight how the pandemic has either strengthen these challenges or transform them into new obstacles for the protection of forced migrants and refugees. If we recall, before the pandemic, the world was already facing a challenging scenario for the protection of forced migrants and refugees. We were seeing the continuation of drivers of forced migration alongside a slow and regional normative development, with a lack of complementary pathways for the protection of forced migrants besides refugee status. We started also to see some institutional or structural challenges in the sense of institutional competition among different structures and due to different mandates on the protection of forced migrants, as well as a lack of resources for humanitarian aid and humanitarian protection. We are also seeing some political choices that aimed in offshoring protection or creating third-party solutions, showcasing the lack of political will to actually increase protection for migrants. Even though we have seen in 2016 the adoption of the New York Declaration on Migrants and Refugees, and in 2018 the adoption of the two global compacts for migration and for refugees, which propose to bring a new governance framework for migration. But besides these documents, in practice, we were still seeing the securitization of migration, the criminalization of migration, and also the politicization of migration. If we look into the rise of populist governments and that used a nationalist platform, they used, as was previously mentioned, this logic of us and they, or us and the others all were seen in the figures of migrants. This led to a scenario of discrimination and xenophobia, and also a very important and continued challenge that we have in the governance of migration, that's the lack of action in durable solutions. Even though we have set some concepts of refugee protection and unforced migration, and the compacts talked about a logic of development and human rights to protect forced migrants, we are still in a scenario with I won't say absence of durable solutions, but durable solutions in numbers that are very lacking in terms of the needs of refugees and other forced migrants, especially if you consider the numbers that were released this week by the United Nations High Commission for Refugees that stated that we have crossed the threshold of 100 million displaced persons due to conflict, violence, human rights violations, and persecutions. And also this week, there was another number that was made public of 60 million IDPs, internally displaced persons, which include persons displaced by environmental issues. In this context, that was already challenging for the protection of migrants, South America is an interesting region for us to study, because historically, South America has adopted a rhetoric of a right to migrate and of solidarity, based on the Cartagena Declaration of 1984 and all that follows this document that's called the Spirit of Cartagena, meaning a humanitarian and humane way of protecting and dealing with refugees, and of solidarity with other states that were hosting refugees, but also with refugees themselves. The region also has a long history of asylum and has led the world in novel initiatives such as humanitarian visas or resettlement in solidarity. And also, as a positive aspect, we didn't see so much criminalization of migration with detention or expulsion of forced migrants in the region. However, even though we have this positive history, just before the pandemic, some would place this from 2015 onwards, we have seen in the region an economic slowdown, the worsening of social conditions, and political changes, with a shift to right-wing policies and populist governments, and that impose challenges to migration, especially the political use of migrations. This idea, as I mentioned, migrants as the others, this discourse of nationalism, xenophobia, and the idea of incorporating a fight against migration into political agendas. In the sense, for instance, Chile has not joined the Global Compact on Migrations, and Brazil has joined, but later withdrew its acceptance of the compact. And of course, this has a very relevant impact on the protection of migrants. IOM states that as of May 2020, South America was hosting 10 million migrants, of which about 80% were intra-regional. In terms of forced migration, the biggest and fastest growing flow in the history of the region is the one we are seeing regarding displacement from Venezuela. Venezuela has been faced economical, social, and political challenges for a while. And as of May 2022, according to the R4V platform that consolidates data on displacement from Venezuela, we have 6,133,473 displaced Venezuelans, of which about 200,000 are recognized as refugees, and we have almost 1 million pending asylum requests to be assessed. Spain, Brazil, and the US are the top 3 countries in terms of recognizing Venezuelans as refugees, and Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Brazil are the top 5 destinations for displaced Venezuelans. This displacement from Venezuela, as I mentioned, is the fastest growing and the biggest flow the region has already seen, and it started in 2015. But it grew from 2017 onwards, especially from 2018 onwards. And it was in this scenario of economic slowdown, social challenges, political change to right-wing policies, and of the biggest displacement flow that the region has seen that COVID hit. Most states in the region adopted measures to fight the pandemic, such as lockdowns, curfews, business and border closures. I think most of these policies also happen outside of the region, in other places of the world, as a way of trying to keep social distancing and trying to control the pandemic. But as it had impact to all society, it also affected migrants and forced migrants, including refugees. By June 2020, if we think about normative developments, there has been a research that showed that over 1,800 norms that were restrictive of migration had been adopted. And we are talking about less than 6 months after the pandemic. Migrants were impacted by losing their jobs, a weakening of the remittances that they normally send home, and loss of migratory status. There have been positive aspects, as for instance, the increase in the number of hospital beds in some parts of the countries where migrants were in great numbers, their inclusion in the immunization process, regardless of their migratory status, when states adopt shelters, like is the case of Brazil, in the state of Roraima, they increased the hygiene protocols in these shelters, and the refugees and migrants with regular status were also included in financial aid packages or financial assistance that was granted to the overall population. However, there have been studies such as from Zapata and Prieto Rosas, who showed that there have been a negative impact in terms of the deterioration of livelihoods and social inclusion of migrants after the COVID-19 pandemic. But I think that the main measure that was adopted, the main response to COVID-19 that impacted forced migrants and their protection in the region is the one related to the borders. We see that some of them pre-existed the pandemic, but were reinforced by it. And the main one was the closure of the borders, which created a scenario where migrants were forced to stay in situations of violation of human rights, or couldn't access safe territories, or couldn't have safe access to safe territories. Other measures also impacted the protection of forced migrants and refugees, as, for example, the militarization of the borders, what Acosta and Brumat call militarization of immobility. This is related to the securitization of migration that I spoke about in the first part of my talk, but they use the COVID-19 pandemic as justification for this increase of militarization of the borders. The close of the borders meant that return was blocked, both in terms to return to the countries of origin, but also from South Americans that wanted to come back home. And it also meant the violation of the principle of non-refoulement. For those who study international refugee law, we know that non-refoulement is the cornerstone of protection. It's stated on Article 33 of the 1951 Convention, and it means the prohibition of expulsion or deportation or return to a place where your safety, life, or liberty is in danger. But when they close the border, then they don't even allow the access to a safe territory from which to return to a territory. In fact, they prevent the forced migrants and refugees to leave this country. And that's why it could be seen as a violation of non-refoulement. States have justified this by saying that they were trying to prevent the spread of the disease, but they don't take into consideration a cornerstone of international human rights law. That's the balancing of measures to find the most protective measure possible. We can ask, is the close of the borders the only possible way to prevent the spreading? Do I need to violate international refugee law in order to create these health protections, or are there other measures? Wouldn't it be possible, for instance, to let the migrants in and make them quarantine and test them for COVID-19? Wouldn't this be a better solution in terms of protection and in balancing the interests of states, but the needs of refugees and other migrants? So this has led to the questioning of this violation of non-refoulement. By preventing safe access to safe countries, also the states were infringing rights of forced migrants in general, not only refugees. Because even though non-refoulement is a cornerstone of international refugee law, here in the region, due to the decisions of the Inter-American human rights systems, non-refoulement applies to all migrants. So they need to be let in, their requests need to be assessed, and then there is the possibility of sending them back if they are not in need of international procedures. The closure of the borders also impacted access to refugee status determination procedures. People couldn't put forward their claims. They couldn't be called in for interviews because all institutional facilities were closed down and or had their working hours reduced. From all this, we can see that, in fact, that there was no political will to protect forced migrants and refugees. And they were using the pandemic as an excuse to put this choice in place. Moreover, we could see that there was clear discrimination in the handling of different migrants and different travelers. For instance, here in Brazil, the first border to shut down was the land border from Roraima, which is the port of entry of the majority of Venezuelans in the country. And it was the last border to be reopened. Even when they were opening airports and allowing travelers and persons on the move to enter the country, this particular border, the one that can grant more protection for refugees, has been closed. Reflexes of these measures are still in play today. We can see that there is a backlog of access to refugee status determination procedures. There is a delay in assessing services and also a delay in assessing documents or ways to regularize their migratory status. We hope that the scenario will change soon. And I think by calling attention to the fact that COVID-19 has reinforced existing challenges, we can try to stop governments to using the pandemic as an excuse to violate the rights and the protection of refugees and forced migrants. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Liliana. That's an excellent presentation, and really, again, reminding us that despite the international framework, including the global compacts, international refugee law, international human rights law, and also the regional Cartagena Declaration, other regional human rights protections, but also the regional history of culture of granting asylum. But despite all of this, we still see, as you put it, the securitization, the politicization, the criminalization of migration. And you described really a perfect storm, I think, of these multiple crises occurring all at the same time, including in many ways a political crisis in many contexts in South America, and an economic crisis. And then, of course, COVID enters the picture, and then intersect, and these crises intersect, and then that can produce a lot of exponential problems, right, including discrimination, inequalities, xenophobia. There are a lot of cross-cutting themes, I think, among all three presentations. The situation facing migrants in all three regions actually in many ways are quite similar and affected by many of the same forces, international, regional, and national forces at work. So I welcome anyone from the audience to ask questions. I don't know if you can raise your hand. I'm not sure if this format allows for that, but please do add your questions to the chat. While we're waiting for some questions in the chat, I have a lot of questions. So the chair's prerogative is always really wonderful in these kinds of situations. One thing I'm curious about is in these difficult circumstances, and as you've pointed out, Liliana, this trend toward populism, greater authoritarianism, in all of the regions that you are looking at. To what extent has civil society been able to play a role in addressing some of the problems that you raise? And Sofia, you talked about the NGO ships or vessels that aren't well equipped to be kind of quarantine centers for migrants. But anyway, to what extent are they able to operate and function, or do these border closures and other problems that all three of you have been describing also affect the ability of civil society to be able to play some kind of positive role? This is a question for all of you.
So here in Brazil, what we have seen is that the rise of a right-wing and populist government has tried to silence the participation of civil society institutionally. For instance, there was a council on migrant protection, and as well as other councils involved with civil society, they have been disbanded as soon as the government took place. So what I see is that civil society has continued to monitor the situation, and most importantly, report violations, be by reports, by judicial actions, or by talking into international forums on how things have been changed for the worst in terms of protection. We could also see here in Brazil an increase of the relevance of public organs who have a mandate with including human rights. So they have been more engaged in monitoring violations of human rights and trying to find responses to these institutions. In terms of border closures, I think the NGOs that are on the ground in Roraima, which is the state where most Venezuelans are entering, were the ones who were also able to report violations of human rights and how the impact has affected refugees and forced migrants. So I think civil society has still, or even more, a crucial role to play in scenarios like this.
Kelley, I think you did.
Kelley,
Sorry, I should know better by now. Yeah, Sofia or Sriprapha, do you have any thoughts about this question?
Yeah, I just like to add on what Liliana has already mentioned, at least in the context of South Asia. As I mentioned in as I mentioned earlier, that emergency law has been imposed in different countries around the region, and of course, with emergency law, it really restricts the activities, advocacies, and the works of civil society groups. And this does not really, I do not mention the NGO laws, which are applied in some countries. As you may know that in Thailand, the NGO law is actually being reviewed in the parliament. And there was demonstration yesterday by civil society groups against the enactment of this NGO law. As I mentioned, during the past almost 3 years, emergency law has been applied. And during this period of time, during pandemic, you see also political movements, political protestations. So we have been asking questions whether or not, finally, the restrictions due to the pandemic have been actually exploited in order to control civil society groups to play their roles. But in the same time, I guess civil society groups, especially NGOs, have been playing very important roles in helping migrants. I think this is the case in Singapore, this is the case in Malaysia, and this is also the case in Thailand, where NGOs have been providing humanitarian assistance, access to different services to migrants affected and infected by COVID-19. So, despite restrictions and despite very limited political space due to emergency law and other laws, NGOs still try to do their best. Thank you.
Thank you. Liliana?
I just want to follow up on that, and something that I recalled is that NGOs and civil society were also instrumental in fighting fake news, especially on how to prevent COVID-19 and how to respond to that from a health perspective. I think we have here in South America a plethora of fake news on the subject, some that were even reinforced by the government, and civil society was the one of the actors to which forced migrants reached out to try to debunk these lies.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, and that sort of connected also to another theme that I've noticed throughout the conference, and that's the role of technology in kind of spreading not only fake news, but also good news and positive things that information that people need to know during a crisis like the pandemic. Sofia, did you have any comments about the question on civil society?
Yes, I will focus more on the NGOs that operate at sea rather than NGOs that operate on land in relation to migrants and refugees in Europe. I think, as everyone else, I think the NGOs were taken aback at the beginning of the pandemic, and they decided to suspend their services because they realized that they wouldn't be able to refuel or to go to any ports in order to get food and medical assistance and whatever they needed. So they decided to suspend their services. And I actually think that this might have been a very important factor in the reduction that we noticed in crossings. Because I don't think that COVID, especially in Africa, was a reason that discouraged people from trying to leave their countries and go to a different place, either because they needed to get a job or because they were victims of war and conflict. I think they realized that without the NGOs, they had the very high chance of being drowned or being left without any help. The other issue that, the other problem that we have in the Mediterranean, and we've seen that especially in relation to Italy, is that they have tried to criminalize these operations. And we've seen instances in which the captains or the crews of NGO vessels that rescue migrants and refugees in the Mediterranean have been prosecuted. But against these practices, I think they continue to be very active. They've been helping migrants and refugees on a daily basis. They continue with their operations. And I think the other very important role that they have undertaken is that they're willing to help victims with bringing cases before national courts or the European Court of Human Rights, because they are on the scene and they have evidence and they have the knowledge to support victims to produce a complaint and appear before domestic courts or other courts. So litigation has also been a very important part of their role. I mean, not only rescuing them, but also assisting them with providing them with legal assistance.
Oh, thank you. That's very interesting. Any questions from Chris? Yes.
Yeah, so I have a bunch of questions for everyone. I'll try to ask the broadest questions maybe, so that everyone can take part. The first is, Sriprapha mentioned, that there was sort of an increasing consciousness of the role of migrants in society in Southeast Asia as a consequence of COVID, that sort of weighed against the more negative treatment that everyone has sort of emphasized to some extent, right? On the basis, people became more aware that there was no discrimination by the virus, that having this pool of people without access to potentially national resources in terms of health, et cetera, that could make them more vulnerable, citizens themselves. So I'm curious, does this play a role in the regions that you look at, Sofia and Liliana? I mean, I'm less familiar with South America. I have a feeling that in the Mediterranean, maybe this is a little bit less the case, and part of that might be because so much of the treatment of migrants in the Mediterranean that we think about has to do with bordering as opposed to treatment of non-nationals, right? So a lot of the presentation that you engaged in, Sofia, had to do with keeping migrants away from countries. But I wonder, thinking maybe a little bit more about migrants who are present in Europe, for example. I mean, do you see this to some extent in Mediterranean bordering states? And for Liliana, I mean, does this something that maybe comes up in South America at all? Increasing consciousness of the fact that migrants are in fact present in society, and it's important to provide for their rights given the situation with COVID.
Thank you, Chris. Should I go first? Well, I don't think that this has been the case in Europe. I think the European Union has taken a very strict approach, and it has been securitizing the borders. So the idea is that migrants should not come to Europe because they are a burden. And with this practice, it has been very difficult to give the opportunity to people to explain whether they're migrants or whether they are asylum seekers, because this is a very different situation. And I think this has also, I mean, they're not aware of how much migrants and refugees can contribute to the society. And even now with the war in Ukraine, where the European countries have accepted many refugees, I think they do that just because they realize that it's an unfair war and they have to accept these people. But I don't think that they do that because they realize that the Ukrainian people could actually contribute to the society in many different ways. So I don't have the sense that this has happened in Europe at all. I mean, to give you a different example, but again, it highlights that people who believe and follow these populist ideas that migrants are here to take our jobs and do not contribute to the society and so on and so forth is the UK. And even after Brexit, when they had significant shortages in drivers, in farmers, in many different professions, the people who supported the idea that we vote for Brexit in order to keep them out of our country, keep migrants out of the country, is still the same. I mean, I don't think that there has been any single person who has changed their perception either because of Brexit or COVID and so on and so forth. And actually, I think the crisis, the economic crisis, the energy crisis, which is global, but I mean, we feel it a bit more in Europe because of Ukraine, has made people even more cautious of themselves and trying to keep their jobs and make sure that they have enough to put on the table for their families. So I don't think that it has changed their perceptions in a better way.
So not even the sense of vulnerability that comes from having people who don't have the right of access to health, who might become, disease vectors themselves. I mean, is there any consciousness of this idea?
No. I mean, one would expect that the situation that COVID-19 created would promote solidarity in the sense that, as it was mentioned, COVID affects people exactly in the same way. It doesn't matter where you come from. But I don't think that we got this sense. I think we have become even more isolated in Europe, at least. I don't know how other people experience this whole situation, but I think we have become even more isolated. And by the time we started recovering from COVID in Europe, the war started. So I think we have all been a bit more cautious about protecting ourselves than trying to make a community that would support each other.
Liliana, do you have any different perspectives on this?
No, I agree with Sofia. I think even though there have been attempts to frame the issue in this way, and we can see this in the media here in Brazil, for instance, always highlighting that if you use a mask, you're protecting yourself and others. If you get vaccinated, you're protecting yourself and others. I think this is still a rhetoric that hasn't gained momentum with the whole of society. And if you see, for example, the clashes in northern Chile against Venezuelans and other cases of discrimination and xenophobia, we still see that the solidarity that Sofia was mentioning in terms of COVID-19 and that we are all in the same situation together hasn't been the main aspect in defining anybody's conduct. We have seen, I think, in the beginning of the pandemic, a few reports and media pieces on how refugees and migrants themselves were helping the Brazilian society. So, for instance, when things were closed and there was a couple of Syrians that own a restaurant here in Brazil, and they were giving away meals for people who didn't have the money to buy meal because they had lost their jobs or their business had closed down, in something that I called reverse solidarity, because then the refugees were showing solidarity to the Brazilian population. And we had a few pieces of news like this to showcase how they were contributing, or sometimes they were showing how migrants that were in healthcare professions were helping the society. But I think these were just in the beginning, and I don't think they have changed the public opinion in terms of a long-term commitment and solidarity with refugees and migrants.
Sofia?
So if I just could add one more point, that I think it's important to mention it because it's quite unique in Europe. Because of the Dublin regulations within the EU, it's always the same countries that deal with the problem of migration. So I don't know if people are aware of it, but when a migrant or a refugee enters a country of the EU, then that country, the first country that receives that person, is responsible for handling the requests and looking after them until they are probably integrated in society or they're deported. And that has meant that all these flows that I mentioned earlier through the three busiest routes have resulted in people going to Spain, Italy, Malta, and Greece. So this has meant that the majority of these people are stuck in these countries. And this, of course, has created the sense of, people in these countries have become fed up. And it's not that all of them dislike migrants and refugees. It's that this system, the EU system, does not make sense. And people don't feel that all the countries within the EU share the burden and support refugees and migrants as they should more collectively. And we realized that even more with the war in Ukraine, because it was the first time that we saw countries like Poland or Germany taking on so many migrants so quickly. And we also saw refugees going from one country to the other within the EU so easily, something that had never happened before. So this is something that has created this sense, that we don't appreciate migrants and refugees as much as we should do in Europe.
Sriprapha?
Thank you, Kelley. I'm approaching this from two levels. One is national, another one is regional. At national level, I think I can pick up the example of Thailand, as we all know that when after the outbreak of the pandemics, and that's what I said earlier, hundreds of thousands of migrants workers return home, because of the closure of business and all those things. But then when the restrictions were relaxed, I think that the private sector has, of course, they are always behind the import of the migrant workers already. But then when restrictions were relaxed, then the private sectors has been trying to push the Thai government to further relax the restrictions in order to, for migrant workers to return to Thailand. So there is a kind of increasing consciousness of the contribution of migrant workers to the Thai economy, to the Thai society, especially among private sector. But I would say that the Thai government realized that as well, because bit by bit, they try to relax the restrictions. However, with the coup d'etat, in our neighboring country, that has a lot of impacts on the returning of migrant workers to Thailand as well, because it's very hard to make any distinction between migrant workers coming, to take up the job again, and refugees, asylum seekers affected by the coup d'etat early 2021. And this has a lot of consequences, especially the increasing smuggling and trafficking, along the Thai-Myanmar border. At regional level, I think from a policy point of view, at the policy level, ASEAN as a group and ASEAN member states came up with quite a number of statements and declarations referring to, to the impacts of COVID-19 on migrant workers. However, as you know, in ASEAN, despite a lot of declarations, despite a lot of statements and different measures, the implementation is done at the national level anyway. So ASEAN is quite good, in my opinion, to come up with different policies and documents. But when it comes to implementation, which actually show their awareness, but when it comes to implementation, it doesn't live up to expectations. Thank you.
Thank you. No, and I appreciate Chris's question, because I feel like maybe we're grasping at trying to find a silver lining. I think that was part of the reason, and for my question as well, about the role of civil society, sort of hoping, okay, so what are some of the positive things that are happening? And I think, getting back to Sriprapha's point about what COVID has shown us about, these sort of the myth of borders in many ways, and the problem with these arbitrary distinctions between citizens and non-citizens that states impose on populations in exclusionary ways. I wish we could learn these lessons a little bit better. That COVID might have taught us a little bit more about this. But I mean, one thing that Liliana, I think, raised, but you've all raised in different ways, is one problem really is sort of the lack of balance. So we, of course, there need to be measures in order to try to control the pandemic, to protect the right to health, to protect other human rights that are affected by COVID. But how can that be done in ways that don't end up being so imbalanced in the ways that you've described in the various scenarios and environments that you're working in? I mean, is there what would you like to see happen? And sort of, again, in the interest of trying to look ahead and think about solutions. I mean, are there ways that, are these international frameworks sort of not very effective? And therefore, should we be looking at other tools, at other measures that might be more effective? Or are there ways that these tools that we already have could be better utilized in order to strike this balance that we don't seem to be able to find?
I think from a perspective of South America, I think the violations that we see are not structurally already present in the system. It's not in the core of every action. It's more an ad hoc situation, or in face of a specific government or a specific choice. So I think in our context, I think the framework of international human rights law, and specifically the principles of human rights, meaning mainly non-discrimination and to grant and always choose the norm that's the most protective or that ascertains more protection, I think it would render the system much more humane and humanitarian, and would expand the protection in the country. So I think the existing frameworks, both regional, because we also have the idea of the Cartagena Declaration and the solidarity principle to be applied in the region. So I think it's more a question of implementing them than creating new frameworks or new approaches to migration, at least here in the region.
Thank you. Sofia, Sriprapha, do you have anything?
Yeah, I just like Kelley, I'd just like to add maybe two thoughts about the issue about balancing, imbalancing. I'm not quite sure, but I think I was talking about exclusive state and inclusive citizenship, and I think governments, we really have to. There's a kind of need for paradigm shift. Especially in South Asia, for the state to introduce the concept of inclusive citizenship, which is not based on nationality, because what is happening, in South Asia and in other regions, it looks like enjoying of rights is based on nationality. So rather than introducing inclusive citizenship, which is, as I said, not based on nationality, but on the basic human rights and basic needs, the fulfillment of all human beings who are equally entitled to the same rights. So this is something that I think we need to balance between providing access to human rights, and then of course balancing with restriction. The second one that I think is also important, and we mentioned a bit, I have not mentioned about that, but I think it's also important. It was Liliana who talked about media, social media, digital media. And I think during the COVID outbreak, it actually this pandemic has provoked social stigma and discrimination, as I already mentioned, and xenophobia among the population. And of course, in this situation, migrants can be easily labeled, stereotyped, and discriminated against. And this can result, as I already mentioned, in more severe health problems and difficulties in controlling disease outbreak. So it is important for all of us, not only for the governments, but for civil society and academic, to actually engage, in my opinion, with the social media and NGOs working on the grounds for health communications in order to prevent, there's a term that I found in a few articles, infodemic, of information and rumors from spreading among migrants and the wider population. This may help to, balancing what has been happening a bit. Thank you.
Thank you. Sofia, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. Well, again, the situation, irregular migration at sea is very different. And I don't think that there is a problem with the legal framework, because the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, the SOLAS Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, the Search and Rescue Convention, these are conventions that have been in place for years. They are very widely ratified. And the duty to render assistance at sea in all maritime zones is customary law. And there is no doubt that if there is a commercial vessel that requires assistance, if it's a cruise ship that requires assistance, that everyone will help and the conventions will be complied with in a perfect way. I think the problem is with the perception of states and the idea that migration has become a security issue. And as long as they treat migration as a security issue, then this means that they're not going to comply with these frameworks in practice. The other issue that is important to understand, again, because we're talking about migration at sea, is that migration at sea, as well as many other problems and risks and crimes and maritime security related issues that we experience at sea, are problems that originate from land. So it's not that we can do something to deal with irregular migration at sea. It's important to realize that we have to deal with problems on land. So for example, the porous borders in Africa means that people can travel across countries very easily and reach Libya and then cross towards the Mediterranean Sea. Or political instability and war is this that makes people cross the Mediterranean Sea. Or another example, in the past couple of days, that again, Greece and Turkey, they have their usual problems because of the Aegean Sea, and we have some political tension. Every time that this happens, we see a rise in the vessels, the migrant boats that leave Turkey to come to Greece. So we know that they've been using migrants as a political tool in order to exert pressure on Greece to do what they want us to do. So these kind of problems need to be dealt on land before we're able to find a solution to the problem at sea. Otherwise, I think it's very difficult to find an actual solution for migration at sea.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we may be running out of time. I think, Chris, did you want to say a few words to it? Because I know I can close the panel, but you may want to close the conference as well.
Yeah, I'll say a few things. Just very briefly, because I know it's getting quite late here in Hong Kong, and I appreciate it. Many of our audience are probably quite tired. There's so many things that I want to pick up even from just this panel alone. Keep wanting to discuss factors like did COVID increase the impetus toward migrant externalization, for example, in the Mediterranean? what is it about quarantine on boats? This is really fascinating to me from Sofia's presentation. Is there something inherent about boats that can lead to a determination that this is torture? Having just given a historical presentation about quarantine on boats, this is really interesting. And then questions, for Liliana and Sriprapha about norms in the global South from ASEAN and the Cartagena Declaration and different ways in which states in these regions approach the rights of migrants and refugees, and whether they can be a model for approaching this question of, many of the human rights scholars who have been in this conference have said, we shouldn't compromise at all. Rights need to be fulfilled, and the pandemic is not an excuse. And even though fulfillment has not been, necessarily met perfectly in these contexts, I wonder if some of these norms from the global South, which are sometimes very aspirational, but often more ambitious to some extent than the global norms that we have, can help in realization. That having been said, of course, we do have very ambitious global norms as well, such as the Global Compacts, that haven't achieved this. But sometimes I feel as if starting regionally might be helpful with that. But I just want to, in terms of closing the conference itself, I just want to reflect a little bit on things that we may have learned more broadly. I think we've seen many presentations that have focused on the strengthening of borders, but also, to use a term that Liliana just used, the transformation of borders as well. And in the last panel, we discussed the fact that border zones can be thickened by pandemic-related concerns, and we can think about externalization in that framework as well. The fact that there's been forms of extraterritorial enforcement, the need for pre-testing requirements, and that kind of thing. So borders are sort of spilling into different spaces where they've kind of spilled before, but in new and transformed ways. We've also thought a lot about international law, how it's gone unfulfilled and unfollowed, and as some have stated in other panels, failed. But we've also seen new proposals, new thoughts on what is necessary to emphasize within existing frameworks like international human rights law. And we've seen new perspectives from public health, history, et cetera, that maybe can lead us toward better implementation of international legal norms in the future. And finally, I think at this point, and maybe this is grasping at straws, looking for a silver lining, as Kelley noted. At this point about the fact that there might be a new sense of vulnerabilities arising from inadequate rights protection in general. I wonder if this is generative, and it's not just the point about migrants as a potential site of infection, which may not be realized everywhere. Although it seems as if there's some realization of this in Southeast Asia, but also the fact that rights can be taken away from anyone. And we saw this in the first panel discussing Australia in particular, and the fact that the right to leave and re-enter a country and the right of freedom of movement within one's country seemed to be taken away from all citizens, and that led to a kind of outrage. And so I wonder, maybe speculatively, maybe hopefully, if there's some generative potential in that realization, right? And it's sort of almost this point related to Hannah Arendt's, right? That the taking away of rights from migrants can help all citizens realize that their rights are under threat, and particularly when citizens see that their rights are under threat in a similar way. This can be something that can potentially help them realize the fragility of rights overall, the lack of protection that may be available to everyone. So I want, with that thought, maybe simultaneously sad, but maybe also somewhat helpful, I want to thank everyone for participating in this conference in any way, whether chair, whether member of a panel or audience member. And I hope it's been as interesting and generative for you as it has for me. So thank you so much, everyone, and good night from Hong Kong, or good morning, good afternoon to wherever you are.